Hey there, Dr. Christianson here. If you've had thyroid disease, is diabetes relevant to you? How can that affect you? I made up the term Thyrobetes because the overlap between these two diseases is so profound and so extensive. Actually, it was first back in 1927 that some researchers saw people that had both hyperthyroidism and type 1 diabetes, that when the thyroid was managed by taking out part of the gland, the diabetes radically improved. And that was with the first glimmerings of overlap. Since then, we've learned so much. We've learned so much about how these diseases really are interrelated with one another. So at the most simple level, we can think about it in a couple of ways. One of which is that if you've got thyroid disease, your risk for developing diabetes is so much greater. And on the flip side, vice versa as well. If you have diabetes, you're also at higher risk for developing thyroid disease. So how do these things overlap? Well, in terms of the overall underlying causes, there's a certain number of genes that affect how we use fuel. How the body makes glucose, transports glucose, and gets rid of glucose. That's primarily through a couple of steps. We absorb it through the intestinal tract from our diet. We generate it from our liver. We release it from our muscles. And also we take it up by our muscles and we burn it by our muscles. So those are the main parts of that equation. And with thyroid disease, we often see issues of fatigue and weight gain. Well, those are coming about because the fuel is not being utilized properly by the muscles. So fuel is being stored as fat, not burned as energy. Diabetes, we've got that same problem. The body is not properly utilizing fuel. So case in point with hyperthyroidism, for example, Graves' disease, that exaggerated amount of thyroid hormone causes your liver to crank out way too much glucose. That in turn makes glucose intolerance and insulin resistance. Those that have the highest levels of T3 in the case of hyperthyroidism, they've got the highest risk of type 2 diabetes. So there's overlap by degree of the risk. Then more commonly with hypothyroidism, we think about that as well. Big version of it being Hashimoto's. So in the case of Hashimoto's, we know several factors that go on that relate to diabetes. One of which is that the intestinal tract actually does a worse job at absorbing glucose. So kind of a funny thing, there's many concerns about carbohydrate that are just in the culture right now, but specifically in the thyroid world, many fears of carbohydrate. And the paradox is that there are problems with glucose metabolism, but they're not really because the body is getting in too much glucose. They're more problems of how the body is working with its own glucose. And ironically, when you consume too little glucose, that can be one more factor causing your liver to make too much. So where's glucose from? Well, carbohydrate foods are mostly glucose or fructose or lactose in the case of dairy carbohydrate. And glucose and fructose, funny thing is that we have more glucose from intact ancient whole grains, good versions of carbs, and also legumes, and more so fructose from fruit and vegetable carbs. Now, glucose is your friend. Intestinal glucose does good things, but when your body doesn't get the right amounts, doesn't get enough, you have to make too much of it. So one of the problems with hypothyroidism is that there's too little glucose absorption, and there's more buildup of glucose in the bloodstream. But again, it's not that you ate it and that's how it got into your blood. It's that you didn't eat it or you didn't absorb it, and that caused you to make too much of it, and that ends up making it stored. There's also this increased process of breakdown of stored glucose. So plants make a thing called starch, which is glucose packed up really tight. Animals like us, we make glycogen. That's like our animal version of starch. And that's how we store carbohydrate, especially. So I'm doing this. We store it in our muscles, our main skeletal muscles, but also within our liver. And when we want to pull glucose in the bloodstream, we break down that glycogen, and that's a good thing. But the problem with thyroid disease is there's too much breakdown of glycogen. The body does a bad job of storing it properly, but breaks it down too fast. And that's, again, that whole double-sided fatigue and weight gain issue that goes on. Also with hypothyroidism, we see that the muscles don't burn glucose as effectively. They're not really making fuel out of it. It's been shown that thyroid hormones even within normal ranges. This is kind of a fascinating thing I've seen in the research. So yes, being normal versus hypothyroid, totally relevant, but also in the normal range, your amount of thyroid hormone directly affects insulin resistance and also HDL levels. So within normal, being more on the hypo side, your body has a harder time utilizing insulin and does not make protective HDL as effectively. Thyroid hormones also affect the risk of someone becoming diabetic. And this has been shown also within that normal range. So when your TSH creeps above 2.5, it's been shown that you get worse with insulin resistance and you get worse at beta cell function. Now, those are the cells in the pancreas whose job it is to generate and store insulin. And when they're healthy, they make it and they store it, and you give your body a big blast on demand when you need it. When they're not healthy, you can't store it effectively, and the body has to have a trickle of it just all the time. Another big overlap is a gene called GLUT4, or GLUT4, and that's an important one that involves how glucose gets taken in to your muscles, so your muscles can burn that. Now, T3 levels, when they're deficient, they can make insulin less able to bring glucose into the muscles. But the paradox here is that when T3 is too high, it's also a problem. So being, not too hot, not too cold, just right on T3 is a big factor. There's also many other enzymes that break down glucose that are associated with GLUT4, and T2, one of the lesser known thyroid hormones, is a big regulator for that. Tiny little aside on T2, I'm a fan of natural desiccated thyroid over synthetic thyroid, and one of the perks of it is you get T2. There's data saying that it's an important one all onto itself. It's not just T3 and T4, T2 is also important. So those are all ways by which those with thyroid disease have problems with diabetes. So let's flip that. It's been shown that amongst those who are diabetic, they've got higher risks for peripheral neuropathy when they're marginally hypothyroid. So a big concept again, so not just they've got blatant thyroid disease that no one's treating, but they're what you call normal. Their TSH is between 0.4 and 4.5, but they're on the higher end of that. That predicts neuropathy. They've also shown that diabetics are more prone to get this thing called euthyroid sick syndrome. Now that's what's going on when T3 runs low, reverse T3 runs high, but T4 and TSH doesn't really change as much. So diabetics are prone to that. So cursory evaluations of their thyroid may look fine, but they're not using those hormones right. They're causing a big problem for them. And it's also been shown that for those who are diabetic, when they've got any marginal thyroid abnormality, their risks for heart disease, hypertension, they escalate greatly. In terms of actual numbers, we see that diabetics have 2 to 3 times the risk of thyroid disease as non-diabetics do. This is especially a problem amongst females. It's also been shown that diabetics have higher rates of thyroid cancer as well. So big issue, big overlap. It's been shown even further along those lines that their body weight and their triglycerides run higher for diabetics when their TSH is greater than 3. So yeah, normal range, but a little bit high, big problems for them. Fascinating thing, but right now in medical research, they've identified that so many bad things of diabetes are just like good things that thyroid hormones do. They're trying to find medications that are like thyroid hormones but aren't, because you can't make someone hyperthyroid or thyrotoxic without there being dangerous to their heart. But if there's some way you could not have it do the bad things of too much thyroid hormone, but have it help their sugar, it would be the perfect cure for diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So lots of research going on right now like that for thyroid-like hormones that could be generated. So action steps, if you're diabetic, screen your thyroid function very carefully. So not just, the doc on the block, your scores look fine, call it good. You need thorough testing. Your TSH has got to be below 2.5. Otherwise, you're at all sorts of medical risks within diabetes, as well as likely being hypothyroid. Consider a thyroid ultrasound, get a good exam. You've got higher rates for thyroid cancer. Screen for thyroid antibodies, screen for reverse T3, look at your T3 scores. Those are all critical for diabetics. If you've got thyroid disease, you also want to go really deep in your blood sugar metabolism and make sure that it's well managed. There's one test I like a lot called an A1C. That one gives us about a 3-month average of your blood sugar. And lots of data says that it's a strong predictor of your long-term health. I'd like to see it below 5.4. Right now, most labs say are normal up to 5.6. Thankfully, they keep creeping that down. It used to be like 5.9 or 6.0, but really 5.4 under is probably the sweet spot. Also test morning fasting glucose and morning fasting insulin. Those give a full picture about shorter term control. And if there's any questions, also consider glucose tolerance testing. So thyroid, diabetes, thyrobetes, big overlap, super important. Lots of things that affect them both and concerns for both audiences. Dr. Christianson here. Take great care of yourselves. We'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.